Hello and welcome to We Need to Talk About HR, a weekly podcast where we explore the forces shaping our roles today, from new technologies, shifting expectations to tightening budgets. I'm your host, Felix Mitchell. Now, before we get going with the show, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Pinpoint, for making this episode possible. Pinpoint, in my opinion, is a fantastic applicant tracking system. We use them across a number of our clients at Instant Impact. Absolutely love their functionality. They've got some really cool features around anonymizing applications in particular, fantastic reporting suite, and a really smart and exciting product roadmap as well. I think they've really got their heads screwed on tight. Whether you're a small company or a larger company looking for a really modern ATS, I definitely recommend you give them a call. Just go to pinpointhq.com and specify that you heard about them through We Need to Talk About HR. You'll get a Friends of the Podcast discount. How cool is that? Now, on with the show. I think we can all agree that we want to build high-performing teams where everyone can flourish. Look, that's all well and good. It's easy to write down on a mission statement and it's easy to talk about on a podcast. But if it were so easy, everyone would be doing it. In truth, people leaders often have to take a more pragmatic approach, working iteratively to create that reality over time. And there are really big challenges to get over. It can be really difficult to exit those toxic high performers, and it's no small feat to challenge your CEO or leadership team to exhibit the right behaviors when they're not, especially in the challenging economy that we've had for the last few years. My guest today is John Edge. He's the Group HR Director at Quintessential Brands. He has decades of experience at companies that range from SMEs to household names like Nestle. He's seen it all, so I can't think of anyone better to get into this interesting topic with. So John, welcome to We Need to Talk About HR.
Thank you. No, really great to be here, and thanks for the invite.
So let's get into the meat of the topic today. I think a lot of people in our people HR space, I don't think anyone's going to argue that you want a caring culture, a culture that's there to sort of foster everyone's performance. But I think that's all very well and good in theory and in the books that we read. But often we're inheriting an organization from someone else. I know a lot of the organizations you've worked with are 50, 100 years old. We're inheriting leadership teams. We're inheriting egos. How do you start unpicking some of those more, once you've established the culture you want in an organization, how do you start unpicking some of those more challenging elements of the culture that you don't want in a business?
That's a really interesting question. Certainly in my younger years, I would have advocated for this fantastic culture and that's all that mattered. And as you become more senior in HR, you understand that those cultures then have to deliver. And it's a balance between delivery of objectives, of business results, and this fantastic culture that you need to find, create, and advocate for within the business. And those two things have to coexist together. So sometimes there's trade-offs, I guess, between the culture you want and the performance that you can get from those things as well. However, with culture is just a microcosm of lots of individual people coming together to work, and then you're trying to get all of those people working in a similar way, behaving in a similar way with similar values, I guess, from that side of things. And it's not as easy as that. Obviously, people come with their own variations of what they want to achieve. They come with their own goals, aspirations to being in an organization, and trying to wrestle all of those things into a singular direction is very difficult.
It's really, I mean, I completely agree with you. I mean, my business is 75 people, and we're already, we've already got that. I think we've got a great culture. I think we've got great individuals, but we've already seen that very complex dynamic between there's that high performance and performing against business objectives on the one hand, and then behaving in the right way, quote unquote, on the other. And I think you and I have had some really interesting conversations around one really fascinating. Not that we haven't had conversations around other areas, John, but there's one really interesting and challenging area, which is, what do you do with a very high performer? It could be anywhere in the business. And I think you often see them on sales teams, someone that's absolutely nailing their quota. You often see them on leadership teams, someone who's, very dynamic, lots of presence, but often throws their weights around. What do you do with someone who's got those traits that you want from a performance perspective, but that is exhibiting more toxic behavior, narcissistic behavior on the other side?
I think if you were being recorded on a podcast now, you say you don't tolerate it, and those people are performance managed out of the business. The reality, my reality, is when someone is delivering exceptional business results, that will, in some ways, overcome some of their behaviours, and it becomes a very difficult conversation to have in terms of what you tolerate in order to achieve the business results. There was a great quote from Holly Tucker, who, when she was growing her business, not on the high street, and she said, "I'd rather have a hole than an arsehole," which I kind of came and liked very much from that. The reality is, with senior people, when they join organisations, they come with a track record of performance, they come with aspirations, and they come with their ego, as we all have, and we all do. And it's trying to then balance what are your personal aspirations about achieving within this business, and how do we want you to behave across the whole of the business. And that's obviously where the rub is. And I think from that side, that's where you really need your CEO to be on board with the culture, on board with what it is that you want to achieve within the organisation, and more importantly, how you want to achieve that. So the damage that one person does can be immeasurable with that culture, to other people, to lower people within the organisation. And it's a big question, and I haven't got a great answer for you, other than I think I'd like to say if it was my organisation, I might be tougher than some of the CEOs and MDs that I've worked with, but I also totally understand the need for business performance, and I've not been fortunate for a number of years to work for a business that just made loads of cash, printed cash every month. It's hard, it's tough, and so therefore trying to be successful and trying to balance this behavioural aspect is difficult.
I mean, I agree, and I think particularly in the environment that we're in today, I think the last 18 months have been challenging for most businesses. I think the last 5 years have been challenging for most businesses. So having a conversation with your CEO around removing a big source of revenue is hard. So what do we do in those sorts of situations?
That's a really big question.
Tell me, John.
What do we do? That is the $100 million question. And I read a lot. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and you hear a lot of people say, "Well, we don't tolerate and we remove." That hasn't been my total experience. I think it's about trying to talk to the CEO to get them to understand the potential impact that person is having within the wider business. And often if you're the CEO or even in the C-suite, you're not aware of what's happening 2-3 layers beneath you at all. You're very concerned with your cash management, your EBIT, your net sales revenue, etc., not necessarily some of the climate of the business from there. So I think it needs to be a conversation that's had. I don't think it's a conversation that you fit a key in a lock and turn it and it opens and you get a result. It needs to be a conversation that you have multiple times. But again, it needs to be the CEO that's interested enough to actually be curious to that as to, well, what impact is that having on my business that might be greater potentially than the revenue they're bringing in as a senior person within the organization.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, giving the CEO perspective, I suppose, from where I sit, a lot of people just expect you to be completely omniscient about everything that's going on in the organization, and that can't be the case. Without the right leadership, the right departmental heads, the right directors around you, there's no way that you can understand exactly every single piece of interpersonal dynamics that are going on within the organization. So I agree with you. I think we rely on our people leadership function or our departmental heads to come to us with those sorts of challenges. And I think where we're a small organization, so I'm sort of projecting a little bit into the future here. I think where the people leadership can do more around, helping us make the right decision is exactly what you were saying, is really on helping us to realize that there is a true business cost to keeping that person in the organization that, in my experience, usually outweighs the benefit of keeping someone in the organization. But the challenge is that the benefit's really tangible.
Yes.
Right? It's right there. This person's brought in $500,000 worth of revenue this year and is second on the leaderboard. Whereas the rest of it is harder to measure. Have you had any success in building that business case to speak the language? And I know you probably have to tread a little carefully here, as we will have our confidentiality element.
Yeah, there's things that you can do. It doesn't just have to be a HR conversation with the CEO or MD. And certainly when you look at different avenues, most organizations now do some form of engagement survey or some form of exit interview data that you hold and look at from there. Other more tangible ways can be, one organization I worked for did a lot of skip level meetings. So a senior person would skip the next level down and then go and sit with that team. And it was really kind of, what's going on? How's it working? What do you think? And again, that comes into that word that I've used a couple of times already about curiosity. You've got to be curious as to, well, why does that happen, or why is that turnover in that function higher than other areas of that business as well?
Skip, that's a really interesting concept. I mean, did you find anything out from those meetings that you didn't find out from normal performance reviews?
The most interesting part there is how comfortable is the leader that's being skipped to allow that other more senior person to come and talk to their team. And that's a big indication there of, okay, am I comfortable to completely come in and ask whatever you want, or are there things that I really don't want them to talk about? And there were some times when senior people were briefing around, okay, don't talk about this. If this question gets asked, you must say these things there. But
it's a bit of a red flag.
It's a red flag in its first place, yeah. And particularly if that comes up at the skip level meetings. So those were interesting. Other bits that I've seen be really, really impactful are, coffee and croissants with the CEO in the morning for 45 minutes to an hour, as long as, again, is you're listening and really curious again, and probably asking more questions than talking. And another area that's been very successful for me is in almost debriefing of engagement data, particularly at cross-functional teams level, is to have one or two of the C-suite present when that's being debriefed, but with a very strict brief of, you can't justify or defend, you can only ask clarification questions. So it's very easy as a senior leader, and I've done it myself as well, where you go, Felix, you don't understand. If only you knew what was going on at that time, you'd have understood that question or that answer that was given. So when you take away that ability to justify or defend previous actions, you get a much more free-flowing conversation, and you get information that, as a senior leader, you possibly wouldn't have heard. And again, you start to build that picture along with some of your engagement data as to, like, okay, where do we need to look into and deal with?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think that free-flowing feedback's so important, so challenging to get right. I mean, I think one of the big differentiators between good performers and great performers is their hunger for feedback.
Yeah.
But I found a true comfort with getting feedback actually pretty rare. So how have you fostered those sorts of flows of feedback?
Talking about performance management and a systemic way of dealing with that's really tough. You do your end of year or half year review, and in comes the crap sandwich, which is, here are the things that I'm really happy with. This is what you need to improve on. Here's the other piece from that. It's difficult, and I don't think you ever really get used to that sort of tightening inside as to, like, I'm going to be told something that I don't like. The more you're told things, the more open that conversation is. Not open the conversation, the more those conversations take place. And again, in that circle of trust, in that kind of I'm telling you this because it's beneficial for yourself. I'm not telling you this to justify a performance rating or whatever it might be, is the area where you then come into that human to human connection and that relationship building and rapport. And I can think of in my career senior leaders that I've really enjoyed partnering with, where that conversation where they tell me, actually, John, what HR did then wasn't particularly strong, or it didn't go down very well, because so much easier to take because you trust that individual, you trust that person, you've got that relationship with them, than when it comes from that area where you don't have that, and your first question is why are you telling me this? Or again, that justify and defend, where you don't understand why we had to do that. And that for me is the bit that I love about HR is just how do you cultivate those relationships, which is back to your earlier question around culture. How do you can't have a culture of best friends, but how do you have a culture where there are more positive relationships, where people are genuinely trying to help other people out and collaborate?
Best colleagues.
The best colleagues, and they exist. They're out there. I've worked with many. How do you replicate that? That's the question. That's the really, really difficult part.
There's a great framework for feedback that we use at Instant Impact, which comes from No Rules Rules, which is it's a great book all around the Netflix story and the culture they've built there. But they've got a 4A framework. Let's see if I can remember. If not, we can always edit it out and pretend like I got it. I got it. So the first is for the giver of feedback, and you have to be aiming to assist, and the feedback has to be actionable.
Yeah.
And then the second 2A's are for the receiver of feedback. So you have to be appreciative. So you have to say, well, look, thanks for the feedback, and know that it comes from a place of trying to improve you or improve your function. And then you get the choice as to whether you accept that feedback and take it on board, or whether you discard it.
Yeah.
And I really like that, both from it builds the intentions, the right intentions into that framework. And it gives you the choice at the end to say, look, this is feedback. Thanks for it. I'm actually, I don't agree with you, so I'm going to put it to one side. I think that's been really helpful for us to adapt to our feedback culture, which is something that we have right at the core.
I think frameworks are a great way of structuring feedback and allowing that to take place. I still feel a really good relationship would trump that in terms of someone that you absolutely trust, someone that you've got high levels of rapport with, and then you can have a conversation around that. And it's about how do you put yourself in a position to be open and receptive of that feedback. To some of the best feedback conversations I've had is where you've asked for feedback, because that takes away that kind of barrier. But on this hand, also, having been in HR a long time now, it's still far too common where really senior people don't give feedback to more junior people until there's a massive problem. And then when that massive problem comes up, the only solution is that person is being exited from the business. And I had a conversation with someone last night where two out of three exits that tend to happen, I would say the person would be very surprised that that's happening, because those conversations haven't taken place when the issue is this big, whereas it just grows and grows and grows. And those expectations are never translated, they're never given, and then they're not met. And then there's resentment because those expectations aren't met. But from a leadership perspective, if you're not clear on what your expectations are, it's very difficult to hold people accountable to that level of performance.
Yeah, it's got to be regular, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's got to be regular and part of the normal working style. I'm really interested in, I think I would say the holy grail of feedback is getting junior and new team members to feed up to the most senior person in the organization. Any tips?
I think, let me answer that question in a second, and this is an editable bit. That the bit that I'm really surprised, if you'd have told me when I entered my HR career that as a HRD in 20, 25 years' time, I'd be sitting together with someone still talking about a lack of feedback, still talking about expectations not being met, I probably would have been very disappointed that the whole world of work had not moved on from that type of thing, which is difficult. In answer to your question around, any tips for feedback going up, I think unless the senior leader is able to create an atmosphere where that's encouraged, it's just not going to happen. That's the point. I find millennials, without wanting to jump on that bandwagon,
watch it. You're talking to one.
Far more willing to give that feedback and far more keen to engage in those conversations. But we're still all governed by that position of, I'd like to be promoted, I want to stay in this company, I'd want to have a good performance rating, and am I going to do anything that's going to get in the way of that?
Well, bringing us back to performance then. I mean, feedback's obviously very important to performance, but I think one of the things that I know you're really passionate about is driving for high performance. But I think one of the things that can be really problematic in that is our focus on individual performance and individual achievement in a world that actually isn't that geared towards individual success. That's not the reality of most jobs. What do you think we can do to structures and incentives to better incentivize the right kind of achievement?
Reward and incentives is a really difficult area to try and incentivize certain behavior, and most books you read on that topic will talk about game theory, and you put something out and it gets gamed to deal with that. Taking away incentives, I would love to come up with either team-based incentives, which I think drives a certain level of feedback within that team, because the team has to rise together from that. Team-based incentives would be a really key area to look at. The other area then is senior leadership behavior, in terms of how do you incentivize true collaboration over individual performance. And one of my absolute kind of cornerstones of how I define myself is I have more success going for a win-win than I do going for a win-lose. So in those, the 7 habits of highly effective people kind of type situation is looking for that position of, what is it that you need to get from this? What do I need to get from this? And then how do we both walk away with something that is looking like a win? Or how do I walk away with a win, but you know that you've given me that win, and therefore there's almost like a reciprocal piece that needs to come back from you later on from that. So really trying to persuade these senior leaders to be more collaborative in the way in which they go about their day-to-day work, rather than that particular area of, I'm here to win, and if I'm going to win, someone else has to lose, and that's great. If I'm bigger, if I'm uglier, faster, fitter, stronger, more influential, I get my win. But at what cost? And often that cost is someone else loses within your business, and that can't be a good thing. So there has to be an element of this, which is true collaboration needs to be looking at a win for the business, not for an individual, not for a team, not for a function. It needs to be for the business.
So I get that at a conceptual level. I really do. My wife used to work for one of the big consultancies, who shall remain nameless. And not my wife, the consultancy. But I think one of the things that I found really unpleasant about their the business itself is like a really incredible company, but one of the things I found quite unpleasant about the way that they were structured is the way that they did their promotions each year and pay rise reviews each year, which were, there are a certain number of vacancies, like, fair enough, and then everything else was done by promotion committee, and your career coach had to put their coachee's case forward, and a lot of that case was written by the individual being considered for promotion, but a lot of it was on how well you were being represented, how influential your representative was, what else was going on in their world, what other favors they were looking to cash in, and it became incredibly political. And what was designed as a meritocracy, I think, put a huge amount of stress on individuals, and the end result was that it actually made people know exactly where they sat in the sort of combo performance perception ranking of what is professional service. So it caused a huge amount of stress, caused divides, very divisive within the team. It, I don't think, was truly meritocratic, and I don't know. It just feels, and you look at the management consultancies. These guys are supposed to know what they're doing when it comes to incentivizing the right behaviors. So, in a world where we're all striving for the same promotions, we all want to get. Well, many of us want to get a bigger house. We want to get a better car. There is a reason why we're all working up the same career ladder. How do you decouple personal aspiration from and a limited amount of opportunity from this collaborative world? Or how do you create that world of collaboration in a world of competition?
I think you used the word meritocracy, which is interesting because for me, that makes me think of, well, what merits are you using of which to make that decision? And unfortunately, your wife's example, or one of the big four consulting firms, I think so much of who gets promoted depends on your brand, and it depends on the skill of the person presenting you and your case, etc., as opposed to it being a meritocracy. But again, if you were clear on what were those areas that you were going to be promoted on, and one of those areas was collaboration, ability to win across functions, influencing skills, which have been in part of every competency framework that I've ever used. But really looking at those things as opposed to who's winning, who's furthest out front, and people. There are times when people are fantastic at getting stuff done. They're brilliant business people, and that's fantastic. And if you can couple some of that with this whole kind of collaborative approach, I'd rather have a leader that was driving that than a leader that was encouraging me to win at all costs, or a leader that was encouraging me to win at the detriment of someone else losing within my team, my function, my business.
Or win in a way that makes them look good.
Yeah,
which I see a lot.
Yeah.
In fact, in my first job ever, it was when I decided I'd never work. I'd set my own business up and never work for anyone again. My boss at the time, we had no budget. I was in politics out in California, and we had no budget to do anything. So we were throwing an event for free on the charity of everyone else. And I borrowed a speaker from someone in another team, and I got pulled to the side and yelled at for making my boss look bad because I'd leaned on another team to get something done. And I think I feel like politics is often, surprise, surprise, an absolute, like, the most political environment that you can work in. But that really hammered home for me the point around, you can't think of, within an organization, you've got to be aligned around one set of priorities. And if one team helps you get there, that's a win for everyone.
I used to have a leader in another organization that used to say very good advice, but it was like, John, get your defense in order. And it was, okay, good advice, because that meant I was having to defend my position, which isn't a negative thing, but when you have to go in with that mindset of get your defense in order, because there is going to be the opposite of that, there is going to be an attack. And going back to our earlier conversation around where that high levels of trust actually exist, what comes with high levels of trust then becomes an ability to have conflict, but good quality conflict, and conflict that isn't personal. It's more about the situation and the task. Going back to the feedback that we talked around, being open for feedback. If I'm not fearful of that person's agenda, that makes it so much easier to take and to give feedback from there as well.
This point about trust keeps coming up, and it's really interesting, and it's kind of crystallizing for me. If you're operating in an environment where everyone trusts that everyone's working towards the same objectives, that you're not going to get stabbed in the back, that feedback is for the benefit of you, of the individual, of the organization. It just saves a lot of wasted time, a lot of sort of agonizing in your own brain, a lot of politics, a lot of poor performance, a lot of narcissism. Feels like such an important point.
I think it takes away that almost that performance anxiety of what are all the other things that I need to think about. Being in business is hard, is difficult, and if it was easy, then everyone would be making loads of money, etc. But it is hard. But actually, when you have to then think about that layer and use the word politics, that's another element that you have to navigate, think about, and deal with. When that isn't there, and you're just dealing with trusting relationships, where I think I'm going to sound very HR-y now, where you can be vulnerable and where you can say to the person, I've dropped the ball on this. I really need you to help me, or I'm having a really crappy couple of days. Is there any way you can help me for that? Without fear of that being used against you is a really strong, positive place to be. Trying to build organisations that are founded on that is difficult, but you can only do it almost like one relationship at a time, one team at a time, one function at a time. But then if you make that functional, you have to then extend this collaboration beyond to other functions. Otherwise, again, you just build a singular kind of unit in a much bigger colony that's looking after itself.
That's really interesting. I've always found the best way to do that, as you said at the beginning, start at the top. Get the senior team on board, make sure that they've got trust there, encourage, and then over time just make sure that just gets pushed down the organization.
Yeah, I'd agree. That's a great place to start. It's a really difficult place to start as well, because you sit around a table with, 15, 20 years experience and a track record of performance that's got you there, all of your wisdom and curiosity that's enabled you to earn the salary to sit at that sort of place at the table, and with that comes that, use the word again, ego of I'm successful, I'm good, I can do this, here's how I win again, and trying to unpick that with a group of 45-year-old mainly men, he says, is a difficult place to start, and that requires an awful lot of trust to do that in the first place and to start that as a journey.
That's really interesting. I think one of the interesting facets of today's world in HR is quite how challenging it is. We've got a lot of our colleagues on the open job market right now looking to find their new organization. I think they're going to come across many of the challenges we've discussed today, narcissistic high performers, varying levels of trust, varying levels of collaboration. Going into a new organization then with those sorts of challenges, what kind of advice would you have to someone in their first 90 days?
I think when you join a new organization, it gives you that unique opportunity to set your stall out as to how you want to be perceived, how you want to be dealt with in the future, and that gives you an opportunity to set boundaries and to say that's acceptable, that's not acceptable. But also in a new organization, you need to conform enough to build traction to actually get something. So I've seen people come in and really set a stall out that doesn't work for that organization. So being not a chameleon, but being flexible enough to be able to pick up what works here, what doesn't work here, whilst being authentic to yourself around how you want to be perceived within the organization is key. And I think the other bit for me is really understanding how that business makes money, talking from a HR perspective. So really trying to understand the business. How does it make money? Where are the pain points in terms of that business model of how it does make money? And then really start thinking about how does HR then lean into some of those areas and offer the many solutions that you can start to play with in order to make that business a better place. In order to do that, you need to understand and ask questions about the company strategy. And depending on what level you're going in at the HR piece, is how does the HR strategy dovetail in with that company strategy, and how do you link in some of the things that HR are doing with that overall business strategy as well?
Because going back to the point we were making right at the beginning, is how even in the most challenging economic times, you can get the business case across for anything you want to do in HR, right?
Yeah, if you can't persuade your CEO that what you want to do is either good for the business or is going to make them more money, that's a difficult place to be. Yeah.
Well, John, thank you so much for coming on today. It's been a really fascinating conversation.
No, thank you. It's been great. Actually, it's perfect.
And thanks everyone for tuning in. I'll see you next week.